Voor de slides moeten we zeker doen?
Ja.
Ja. Zal je dit even doen?
Ja. Die is al opgelukt. Ja.
Okay, I think we should start. Thank you all for being here today with us to celebrate gender equality and diversity in science. First of all, I want to thank my board and the many volunteers that helped organizing today. I also want to thank the speakers for contributing to this excellent program. And finally, I want to thank the FWO for supporting and promoting this event. Thank you. Today we celebrate equality and diversity in science, together with 100 people who registered and a few are attending it through the YouTube live stream. The focus of today is gender fair recruitment. I want to start with asking you to reflect on this question. What do we want to find at universities? Creativity, originality, and intellectual challenge. It has been shown in organizations with diverse teams that they come up with more original ideas. When everyone thinks the same, talks the same, and looks the same, how can you ever develop something new? All you do is just copy-paste. If you really want people to think and come up with new possibilities, you need to integrate different perspectives and experiences. And this is how we can create a better university and ultimately a better society, since that is where our students and future scientists are headed for. Now I will give the floor to our first panel, and Tanja van Loon will moderate the first debate.
Thank you, Anne, for this nice introduction. So yes, I'm Tanja. In my day job, I work at the VUB, and I coordinate their European license office, so supporting researchers to do fundamental research projects. I'm graduated from UAB, so I'm a really personal person. And one of my hobbies is to support gender balance in scientific careers through Belgian and Women in Science. And I'm the moderator today for the different sessions. Before we actually start, we want to have a little bit of an idea of who's in the room. So maybe the students, PhDs and postdoc could just stand up. Thank you. So we have some representation of the next generations. That's great. You can sit, please. And we're going to do the same for the professors. Professors of universities, please stand up. And it's quite balanced. That's nice. Okay, great. It's not going to be a fight. You can sit down. But I think the idea is to have a real conversation because there are a lot of things that are unclear how the recruitment actually happens in academia. I'm very pleased to introduce our first panelists. They're representatives of funding agencies and of universities, and they will first give us a perspective on gender and diversity rules for fair recruitment that are currently in place in their own institution. A very short biography of the panelists. We have Véronique Hanoin, who is the Secretary General of the Fonds de la Recherche Scientifique, FNRS, since 2008. For those who are not familiar with Belgium, FNRS is the Fund for Scientific Research of the French-speaking community. Véronique has a background in civil and chemical engineering, a PhD holder in applied science. She has been professor and director of the chemical engineering department at the ULB, University Libre de Bruxelles, and also vice rector for research and development there. Véronique is an active member of many high-level international bodies, including the Seven Council and the Global Science Forum. The next speaker is Tim Thijs, who is since 2019 policy advisor at the Research Foundation, Flanders, FWO. And FWO is obviously the Flemish funding agency for scientific research. We're in Belgium here. Tim obtained his PhD in biochemistry and biotechnology at KU Leuven, did a postdoc at INSERM in France. He also worked as a grant writer and project manager in the pharmaceutical science department of KU Leuven. And at FWO, he's involved in strategic research programs, scientific awards, and gender and diversity policies. Our third panelist for this session is Tine Broekaert. She's a trainer and policy advisor at the HR department of Universiteit Gent. Tine studied social cultural work and social policy, holds a PhD in comparative sciences of culture, with an ethnographic fieldwork research on and with undocumented migrant mothers in Belgium and in France. She started as gender policy advisor at UGent in 2014 and wants to safeguard equal opportunities for all employees. I would also like to mention our fourth panelist. She was unfortunately unable to join because she's sick, and it's the case of a few other people, and we are actually thankful that they don't join risk of contamination. It's a pity for them, of course, but people can also join the live stream. So that's the way it is. The fourth panelist should have been Nelly Konijnendijk, who is HR advisor equality at the VUB at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels. Indeed, it will also leave a little bit more time for our panelists because we've asked them a very challenging thing to do, which is to summarize the current gender and diversity rules in place at their institution in 5 to 7 minutes. Now, dear panelists, you're getting up to 8 minutes, so you can expand a lot. For the audience, there will be a question and answer session afterwards. So we're going to presentations, and then it will go to the audience for either questions or maybe your suggestions or your comments. And I have a card with me, right, with 1 minute, so in case you're reaching near the end of your time, I will kindly wave this card. We will start with Veronique. Veronique, you have the floor. Yes, you can stay here and you can wave to Luba here, or to Liesbeth behind the computer.
Yeah, for the next slide, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, first of all, thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel. So, as you mentioned, the FNRS is the funding agency for basic and strategic research in the French-speaking Belgium. We are the contractual employer of approximately 1,800 researchers at different levels of the career, PhD students, young postdoc with 3-year fixed-term contract, and permanent researchers. These researchers are hosted in the universities. We don't have our own infrastructures, and they work in all fields of science. There is the overall gender diversity is really good, as you can see on the screen. There are 43% of women and I don't know exactly, it's 57% of men. But this is really depending a lot of the field as well as of the level in the career. We have also a nice international diversity, depending again on the level, the position, the level in the career, with between 25 and 50% of the researchers coming from abroad. As a funding agency, I think that our recruitment policy is slightly different than the one in place at university. We organize one annual call for recruitment, and it's a bottom-up process, so there is no preferred area field of research. It's really open to all disciplines in a bottom-up way. This is the difference in universities. And regarding the evaluation process, the applications are evaluated by international experts and panels, and funding decisions are taken by the board of directors on the basis of the ranking made by the scientific panels. And we have taken several measures regarding gender issues. We give women an extra year per child in our eligibility rules to apply for a research position. As we know that international mobility is less easy, maybe less easy for a female researcher, but here is not mandatory. In addition, the application form gives the applicant the opportunity to explain the lack of mobility, of international mobility, if he wishes or she wishes to. I think it's interesting to note that the qualified researchers or permanent researchers recruited over the last years, 20% of them had no long mobility, international mobility. It's also important to note that mobility to Flemish universities can be seen as an asset. So it's a plus in the application. Finally, well, we have also a free section for any comments that the applicant may wish to make. This, I think, is also very important. Regarding the evaluation process, we have an increasing proportion of female members in the panels, which tends to balance. In addition, at the beginning of each meeting of scientific panel, in the introductory speech, we make the members of the panel aware of possible gender bias. Furthermore, we have signed the global declaration, and so the evaluation work is not at all limited to simply counting the publications, the number of publications, which we know can be penalizing for female researchers with children. Finally, we systematically make in-depth post-call analysis, really to check if there are no any bias that we can detect, especially gender bias in our evaluation in our procedures. And our statistical analysis show that the probability of being awarded a mandate or fellowship is not dependent on the gender. So, but however, we also find a well-known phenomena of leaky pipeline. We see that the proportion of female applicants is decreasing when we go in the upper functions. So 50% of applicants female for PhD, but only I see 30% for permanent position. And I mentioned to someone else, I think the pipeline, the leaking pipeline is very meaningful, but I think not really inelegant, so I prefer to speak about the evaporation of women as one moves up to the career ladder. So the next slide, we can see with specific gender initiatives in place that are not necessarily directly related to the recruitment process. So doctoral female students who have a child during the thesis benefit from a 3 months extension of the grant, and during maternity leave, the amount granted by the health insurance is complemented by the FNRS. We have a gender contact person published every year a report on the state of the gender equality, and she also exchanged with the gender contact persons in the universities about actions, raising actions around this. So since October 2021, we have launched a working group for gender whose mission is to draft the gender equality plan. And an observatory for research in scientific careers has been set up by FNRS. And thanks to funding from the World University Federation, it aims to study researchers' careers and putting emphasis on some specific questions such as gender issues. For example, a person leader is present with managing the observatory, so she will be very pleased, I think, to answer any questions on the topic. And on the next slide, it's the last one. That's okay. In our communication materials, various news, TV, social networks, we ensure a gender balance in the portraits of female and male researchers that we offer. And this provides an opportunity to introduce many women researchers, and they can help represent more females. We are part of the L'Oréal UNESCO Foundation, which develop actions to accelerate the careers of women scientists, encourage the next generation, as present today, yes, of women to turn to science. And we are also partners of AcademiaNet. I don't know if you are aware of that net. It's a database, it's an international database containing profiles of excellent female researchers, and it's a tool to help decision makers find proven female experts, and also to raise the share of women in leadership positions in academia.
Fantastic, thanks a lot. Yes, this is the perfect time. Thanks a lot. Thanks for this really nice overview. I think it's really good to see that there are a lot of measures to improve the situation. Also to see that there is an increase of women in panels, for example, in the evaluation panel. It's actually also somehow interesting and also good to reflect on the fact that the probability of getting getting awarded the grant is not as such a problem, but that it's more about stimulating female applicants to actually apply. So I think this is really something that we need to reflect on. We're going to move now to the next panelist, Tim, who we want to do it in a truly Belgian fashion, as I said, so moving from FNRS to FWO. So please, Tim, the floor is yours to explain what is happening at FWO in terms of existing measures.
Thank you, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to elaborate a bit on what we try to do at FWO. We share many similarities with colleagues of FNRS, like the partnership in academia and the UNESCO L'Oréal for Women in Science program. But let me start by saying FWO is always, like I think almost any other funding organization, very strong on scientific excellence. That goes before everything. However, in order to come to scientific excellence, it's a bit of an umbrella term. Excellence can be defined in many ways, and in order to achieve excellence, what is also important is that we try to achieve a level playing field. A level playing field, a completely level playing field might be unrealistic to achieve, or even impossible to achieve, but we should try and do our very best to make the playing field as level as possible. Now, at FWO, we have installed a number of policies over the last decades to achieve that level playing field. First of all, much like FNRS, we also have flexible seniority limits. Also, we do not select based on age, or we do not set cutoffs based on age, but on scientific seniority. And I think that's important because in that way you can account for career breaks, which are more common in women, for instance, in terms of in case of pregnancy. We also have the possibility to extend our fellowships. That comes, of course, with a substantial financial cost, but we think it's worth it. So, in case of pregnancy or long-term illness, for instance, fellowships can also be extended. One thing that's a bit out of the box, perhaps, is that we also allow researchers to pay for measures to overcome, for instance, physical disability or functional impairment. Because we don't want to exclude the researcher because he or she would have some disability, for instance. One of the things that's also very important for FWO, and is one of my perhaps main tasks as policy advisor in gender and diversity, is the data monitoring and also data sharing. So after each call, we also do an analysis of the number of women that have applied, not just male, female, and non-binary researchers that have obtained the grant. We report on that internally to our board of trustees, but we also share those numbers on our websites and our annual reports. And also, on occasion, we get requests, for instance, from the FLIR, the Flemish University Council, or from the Young Academy, that they then ask us to check out one or two things, and then we also try to provide them with the data to answer their questions. One of the more specific and very visual measures that we take are the panel quota. So we are legally bound to have a minimum of 1/3 of researcher or panel members from the underrepresented gender. Now, in our recently adopted gender equality plan, we have set that bar a little bit higher. So for the next years, we will strive towards a 60-40 balance. That is also more in line with developments at the European level. So there we try to also keep on improving on what we are already doing. There are also other recent developments that are not on the slide. For instance, we have also introduced the possibility of using a short biography instead of a classical CV, because we want to move beyond the standard metrics, the H indexes, the number of publications and citations, because everybody knows they don't tell the whole story, but still they are convenient. So since we want to move beyond that, we also include the possibility of giving us a short bio where you can tell your story. I think that's important to hear the voice of the researcher, because in the end, research is done for the people in many cases, but it's especially done by people, and we should make sure that we do everything to have all the voices of researchers heard. At FWO, we also try to give the right example to ourselves, set the right example. So we also, as an organization, we have a gender-neutral recruitment policy that includes functional career paths, external assessments, and also equal pay scales per function, so that we do not discriminate there between males, females, or non-binary. And we also, as mentioned also by Veronique, we also try to make our panel members aware of any unconscious bias. Luckily, what we see is that our numbers are in line with the numbers at the university, so we are fairly confident that we do not have gender bias in our panels, but it's a point that we should always be aware of the possible risks of unconscious bias in general, that includes gender bias. That is In short, what we are doing right now at FWO, as mentioned, we have recently adopted our gender equality plan where we have set a number of new targets that we will try to translate into concrete measures over the upcoming 4 to 5 years.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Very clear, comprehensive, and also nice to see that things will continue to move and to progress. I think it's also interesting to see that diversity is not only about gender, but it's also about age, about disabilities. Also interesting to see that you're using already the classification of pushed forward by the European Union on men, women, and non-binary. I think this is also part of the idea of having as diverse team as possible and recognizing everybody's value. So really good to see. Tina, everything is on your shoulders for the representation by universities due to the absence of many, but we'll be really happy to hear what is happening at your university in terms of diversity and gender balance. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Big responsibility, but good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to the organizers. I have only a few minutes, and there is a lot to say about BeWiSe interrupters and rules for recruitment at universities or at Kent University. So, I will walk you quickly to the most important rules and measures to reduce bias at every step of the academic career, but to the full professorship. I think that nobody will be surprised to see the decrease of female researchers at every step of the academic career. In general, the recruitment for academic staff is a very decent process at the faculties or at departments, and with a lot of local flexibility and field commodities, and this applies even more to the PhD and postdoc recruitment. So, we have a lot of tools from central level, also for the recruitment of PhD and postdoc, but it's not mandatory. The only thing that's mandatory now is a new leadership program for PhD supervisors, and there's a strong emphasis on gender and inclusion. They have in their training half a day on bias, about the position, the privileges, the different obstacles, and also specifically to reduce bias in the selection process for their PhD candidates. And then once we go to the recruitment of professors, we begin with tenure track positions. There are a lot more formal rules and tools available from the central administration of the university for the faculties. So if we regard all this bias interrupting tools or with the potential to interrupt bias, we start always with the position. There is an availability within the department or within the faculty, and a vacancy is settled. So we have templates available with a generic description, and then the job content is presented there per core task. So every time we're teaching, research, and services. And there is a mix of behavioral requirements also. So the candidates also need to write a fitting text about how they fit in the research team for their research, but also as a person, how will they function within a team. And everything is done with an online application system. And we also have space for atypical career paths or bias sketch to mind interruptions or delays in the career due to, for example, pregnancy or intrinsic openness. We also have the disclaimer on diversity and inclusion, and every vacancy needs to set up a minimum 2 languages, Dutch and English. And from the central level, from the Unit of Diversity and Inclusion, we also provide a tool for inclusive communication. There's also a part specifically for vacancies. At the end of the presentation, I have included the link, so everyone who's interested can also go and visit this website and see this too. Yeah, and then the publication need to be published at least for during 1 month, and it's also almost an obligation to publish widely internationally in both languages. To prevent bias, the candidates' names and the applications are only provided to the selection committee after the registration deadline. And then the evaluation committee is always gender balance, as every committee or board at Ghent University. And in addition, some committees can also choose, for example, to include an extra member in their committee. For example, someone from the unit of inclusion and diversity. And then candidates, we regard at candidates research, teachings, institutional or societal services, and also the international mobility. And they try to look at every candidate, or they try to look at their specific criteria in a broad way. And also to exclude bias. For example, they are going to look at the research not only in a quantitative way like they did before, but now they are trying to look more qualitatively. This means they are going to look, they ask for the 5 best publications or realizations. And when it comes to international mobility, for example, we look at also very broadly. We also take into account internationalization at home, or even when, for example, different teaching tasks at other universities but within the same country can count as international mobility. Now, I also mentioned before that interruptions in your career are taken into account. From central level, we have a manual with good practices and pitfalls to structure the interviews to prevent bias for every criteria and every question that is asked to the candidates. But in addition, selection committees can also ask for bias interruption training. And then the next step, once you enter the tenure track position, actually the normal path to the full professorship is actually one without competition. It's only the core idea is the one who performs well and functions well will be appointed the full professorship almost automatically. But we have one exception, and that is the fast track. So for the few very excellent researchers, there is a faster way to the full professorship, and I will explain. How we also take into account gender balance within this fast track. The next slide, it's about the smooth pathway to the full professorship. There's one, every member, every professor is appointed an HR commission. So there are 5 members in this commission, and during the whole path to the full professorship, they will have like intervisions or feedback conversations, and this model, this path, career path, it's also been known as the Ghent model, because there is no competition, but instead there is based on trust and responsibility and talent development, and it's also very tailored on the candidate itself. So the candidate can also choose which talents he or she or they want to develop during the next years. And then the HR commission, they make the puzzle and they meet the candidates further on. But then I also, looking at the next slide, yeah, then there's also, I also mentioned the fast track. You can also go very quickly to the full professorship, and that is actually the correction on the other career path, the normal one. And this only happens once every 2 years. This path is very competitive. There are limited places, and we also want to fix the proportion of male and female candidates. Actually, the number of female and male associate professors need to be represented in the places that are available for this fast track position in every faculty. I'm almost finished. And then in the second round, there is also there are a maximum of 2. So in the second round, is all the faculties together. There's also a general balance of 2/3 that can be appointed of the same sex. I hope that's clear. Yeah, I will finish here. I had some slides for the future, but maybe we can also talk about that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to the 3 speakers. It's nice to see that there are really good processes, tools, and methods foreseen for the tenure track and the professors. It's also interesting to see that it's a very flexible and very decentralized process for a PhD and postdocs, which is probably has some positive and some negative aspects to it. We're going to move to the question and answer, but before that we want to make sure that you're all awake. And so I think Luba or Liselot, there is a Menti, the Menti is there. For those of you who have a smartphone, who have Wi-Fi, which is available, and who want to take part, we have a little question for you. So do you know measures to ensure diversity and gender fair recruitment at your institution? We just heard about FNRS, about FWO, and about Ghent University, but what do you know about your own institution? I'm gonna wait a few seconds more that everybody's logged in.
So the code for it is 81113222.
We've got a little bit of everything on this stage. A few people who are really very knowledgeable, but yes, quite some who haven't been interested or haven't been able to gather the right info up to now. We hope that this will change in the future. And quite some people who know most of it also. Okay, thank you. We're now opening the floor to the audience. So yes, please feel free to ask a question or to put a comment. If possible, please give your name and your affiliation, and Yuba is coming to you with the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kirtana. I work at the Federation of European Neuroscience Societies. Our office is actually just upstairs. And I have a question for Veronique regarding FNRS, when you talked about having a procedure for post-call analysis to evaluate bias. And I was wondering, how do you actually measure bias? And have you had any incidents before where you have to take to that, and what kind of steps would you corrective measures?
No, we make a statistical analysis to see what are the parameters on which the rate of success depend, on which they depend. And so it's really a statistical approach. And from that we say apparently there is no bias, but it's not so. What we can say, in fact, is that the probability to be awarded a membership, mandate or fellowship is not dependent on gender. But it's a bit short to say that because of that there is no bias on this, right?
So if I understood correctly, you look at the selection criteria.
Sorry?
If I understood correctly, you go back and check the selection criteria of the committee? Is that what?
No, but we evaluate, for instance, is the rate of success depending on the subfield of research? So this can be a bias, for instance, because maybe in the panel, the experts from subfield of research are much more severe and not the other ones. So we really check those things because the criteria, it's more difficult. Yes, we check, for instance, the effect of mobility. Do people having a long-term mobility, international long-term mobility, have a higher probability to get a permanent position, things like that, yes.
I'm Anne Jeugd. I'm the program manager of the Career Training Institute, and I've been working in science for 15 years now. I have a question for the FW. So when I was looking at the website of the FNRS, there is something that's called the Maître de Recherche, the Director of Research. It's like a more permanent position for people who don't aspire to become a professor, but stay, for instance, in the lab and become a lab manager. Because not everybody, of course, is equipped to lead a lab. Or so, how do you think FW can also accommodate for that position?
I said in the beginning there would be no fight, but maybe there will be.
Because after postdoc, we have one, of course, renewal, but then it doesn't exist in that family scheme. So.
Yeah, so to briefly explain for those who might not be so aware of what we offer, what we have. So we have the PhD fellowships, of course, and then at postdoctoral level we have junior and senior postdoctoral fellowships. We no longer have a category after that. We used to have something similar to FNRS, the permanent researchers, but we no longer have. So I think there might still be one or two out there who are not yet retired and who might have had such position in the past. But apart from that, there is something that we no longer have. And I don't think in the foreseeable future there are plans to reactivate.
No, but I just think that the system might also have some mistakes in there. Lab management is also very important to keep the continuity of the lab, because now you have a lot of people coming in and leaving the lab after a few years. I think, I understand that you cannot go back to the old system, but I still think it has some benefits also to have positions not only for PIs but also for, let's say, permadocs of what kind of law.
Yeah.
It's a kind of question to all of you, I think. I want to come back on this leaky pipeline, where you have less and less women when you advance in the careers. But when you think about the career, scientific career of women, most of the time it's getting up, and then they have children, maybe other stuff, and so then a few years it stays quite in equilibrium to go up again, but then most of the time they are already 6, 8, maybe 10 years after PhD. I know that most of the universities hire senior PhDs with the criteria maximum 10 to 12 years after PhD. Don't you think that there it is one of the possibilities that you have this leaky pipeline? The difference with the CNRS in France, for example, is that CNRS is not putting anymore an age limit on recruitment. So I think there maybe there is something to do still.
Who wants to start?
I would say ladies first.
I think it's an interesting comment. I agree that the age limit is the issue. At the same time, we don't want to keep people too long without a permanent position. So if you open the door, it's not very fair as well. One thing that is interesting, I've noticed in Switzerland, the National Fund for Scientific Research, SNF, they have launched 3 years ago, I have to check, the pre-grants, for instance. So the pre-grants, these are grants for women researchers who show a high potential for obtaining a professorship. And so they pay for the salary and for the cost of the project, research projects during 5 years. And after that, they enter the competition. The competition for professorship. So I find that this is maybe a nice way to meet the comment, maybe to develop, to launch a funding scheme for women who has slow development of the career because of children, and so to help them to recover and then to enter again the big competition. Good answer.
Tim or Dina, you want to add something?
So at WO, we have recently analyzed our, we call it INSTRO, the application rates for postdoctoral fellowships. So we have split the category, sorry, junior and senior since 2019. Now, looking back at the data from the last 3 years, we have the impression that the main dropout, it happens already in the transition from PhD to junior postdoc.
Yes.
Between junior and senior postdoc, we do not see that big of a gap. Of course, the gap widens again when you go at the professorship level. There we see again that it widens the gap between men and women. So in our view, I think the main bottlenecks are transitions from PhD to junior postdoc and then at professorship level.
Okay, it's really different. 55% for women and for PhD, or let's say 50%, and it's 45 young postdoc. One of the 5 permanent positions is 30%.
Next question, yes. Hello, my name is Ines Jules. I'm the quality coordinator of the Student Council at the BeWiSe. My question is for all of you. I was wondering how you bring intersectionality in your policy plans, because if you only take into account gender discrimination, you leave out a lot of other discrimination as well. So I was just wondering, you also take that into account, or?
Okay, I will respond to this. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, from the European Commission also there is more and more a demand for this intersectional perspective, and we try also to take this into account. But actually, all measures that we take to ensure the lines which are open and transparent and more structuring the selection process also help to attract other people in minority positions. But within, for example, the unconscious bias training that can be asked for the selection committee, we don't speak only about male or female gender, but we approach that from an intersectional point of view. And then, nevertheless, one of the things that we want to do in the future is also more trying to attract people from other minority groups, not only female as researchers.
I think it's perfect because my question transition with what you just said. I'm based in Davos from the Campbell Institute, and we are trying to develop more gender equal recruitment procedure. And my question was about you all mentioned you have the country bias training. I was wondering if you could give a bit of details, or did you set up this training yourself, or do you use commercial solutions, or what kind of training do you mean by that?
Before we worked with a lot of external experts, and it was very interesting to see their perspective, but we learned that it was better to develop it ourselves, because it needs to be very specific to our institution or even to our faculty. So now we make something that fits on the department itself, and it is on demand, and we also see what are the questions, where do we have difficulties? We have difficulties to attract, for example, female researcher, or is it in the selection process that you lose them? But of course, it all besides this on demand and very specifically made for the department, we also have general things in the trainings. You can find also a lot already on this tool who gives some guidelines to structure the interviews.
Veronique, our team wanted to also, we did it ourselves, but like you, but we get some inspiration from our partners with several partnerships. For instance, the Frontier de Recherche, we have developed our own training kit for the panels, and so we took some inspiration from them.
I want to add something more. We also try to, in the mainstream trainings that are not specifically this trainings on implicit bias, we also try to integrate this point of view in other leadership trainings or the supervisor training as much as possible. Because we think, with one training it will not be sufficient, so it's good that the members, they get this several times.
Well, I can just add. So at FWO, we are mainly trying to raise awareness, but in our gender equality plan, it's actually written that we are trying to push forward, or to push more on the training of our panel members in unconscious bias in general. So this is something that we have already done some work on it, but we will do more in the upcoming years as well.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, I also had a question for you, Tine. You say that most of the tools that you have, it's on demand. And I was wondering if there are any future plans to make it obligatory or to increase the percentage, because how many people are asking for it now, percentage-wise, and are there any plans to increase that?
We have one training for the selection committees on demand, and to be honest, it's not asked very often, and mostly it's a female researcher within the department who asks it, and then the selection committee gets a training or several trainings, and then we make some kind of action plan for future selections, the evaluations. And then we have another training, it's more active bystander training that who's working also a little bit on the uncontrolled shoots or shift in mentality. And that's one, it's only 1 hour to 1 hour long, and is asked yeah, a lot more. Just to give you a number, like last year there were 600 members who followed this training.
Hello, I'm Lula Maris from the Student Council of the BeWiSe. And I was wondering, it's a question for Luca. You said that in a normal track towards being a full professor, so not a fast track, there are no mandatory quota for gender. Then how are the gender biases compensated? Because there are still a lot of male professors and in a lot of education directions, more male professors. How is it then compensated, and why is it present in the fast track and not in the normal track?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, no, when you enter the tenure track, then you have a traject and 5 years, and normally everybody gets tenure. And then afterwards, you automatically enter the associate professorship. But now there are a balanced number of positions for the tenure track and associate professorship and even for professorship. So you don't have to go in competition against others or against your colleagues. You, in some way, only have a competition with yourself. So you put some targets and interaction with the HR commission is specifically put up there for you, and you can say which kind of competencies you want to develop, how far or how many applications you want to make for your research or what you want to reach there. And also, you have a fixed number of teaching tasks, and we even work with 5 different roles for leadership. You have, for example, the coach, or you have the manager, and you have like 5 different roles, and you can even look like which one fits your best, and you can develop in that one, and you can also see which kind of roles is most difficult for me, and what can I do to reach a certain level there. But it's not only competition with yourself and engagement. And at several points in this, in your career, you get feedback from the HR commission. But then only in the fast track, there are a limited number of places, and there's really complicated. And then we take into account the representation of gender.
Hi, my name is Andrea Martin. I work at Tequila as a policy advisor on diversity. Thank you for your very interesting contributions, and I have a question with regard to your viewpoint on positive actions. And I know, being a policy advisor myself, that's something that has very different stance and can be very difficult to implement at times. But if I look at our neighbors in the north, in the Netherlands, there the NWO has a specific funding scheme for female professorships, and they've also just relaunched the Mosaic program, which offers PhD grants specifically for students with a non-Western migration background. In the evaluation of these schemes, this works. So I was very curious to hear your thoughts on that, and also to hear if there is a place for that, where and when could it be useful.
Before going to the panelists, so that we have a little time to think, just to mention that there will be someone from NWO talking later this afternoon, so probably we're gonna get a little bit more insight into this. But panelists, if one of you wants to comment.
Yeah, unless you want to comment. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think it can be very, very opportune to have some positive actions. But I also know that's very difficult juridically to put that in place. So I don't know how that the Netherlands did that, or maybe it also adds a lot of courage from the institution or university to do that, because it's not always easy legally. But I am, yeah, I think it can be very good to do that sometimes. And yeah, at which moment in the career plans you could do that? It's best to do that, I think, after from postdoc to tenure track positions, because we have a very high rate of international members in the engineering postdoc community, but they all disappear once in the tenure track positions. But I think it would be a very good idea to have some positive actions there.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the results of the pre-migrant I mentioned, launched by the Swiss Foundation. But they launched it in 2017, and these are 5 years grants, so we are only now in 2022, so we need a couple of years to see if really it has a positive impact on the recruitment of excellent women professorship after the grant.
Okay, there's time for one more question from the audience. I saw.
Yeah, yes. So there was one in the back. I'm sorry, Sophie, you already had. Because of the time is limited, it would be lovely to have open questions. Thank you.
I'm Rowan, a PhD student from BeWiSe, and my question was about the quotas and other initiatives that might have a number-based thing. What happens if you don't meet them, and is there interest in there being binding conditions, and why or why not?
Quotas for the panels or quotas for the grantees and professors? Every quotas.
It's a kind of a taboo, and maybe it's also a cultural thing. Coming back to your comment earlier, it might be that there is a cultural element. Please go ahead.
Like you mentioned, for you at the same at FNRS, everything is based on excellence, so we not envisage to have quota among the grantees, but what we can envisage is to give specific, develop specific measures to take into account maybe the difficulties of the career of female researchers. But it's not a quota in that case, it's something else.
I agree with what you said. Also, in addition, it might be worth pointing out for FWO and I think also for FNRS. So excellence, it goes above all, and we are also very strong on what we call our bottom-up principle. That means that every discipline, every gender, every ethnicity is welcome with us, which is a strength, but it also limits us perhaps in considering these affirmative actions. Because that might go a bit against that principle. So there, it would not be an easy thing to do.
Okay, on these words, the discussion is not closed yet, but you have to stay with it for this first panel. I'd like you to thank all the panelists.
Thank you, and the members of the second panel, please.
It's open right now. Ja, ik denk dat ze eigenlijk meer, ja, dat ze meer naar de micro moeten. Misschien moeten we de micro's zeggen.
I will ask the panelists to speak very close to the microphone because the people who are listening from home have difficulties to understand when you're speaking from far away. So thank you very much. Okay, let's move to the next panel. I think that the next topic is specifically of interest for the younger researchers in the room, so early career researchers, because we're going to talk about what the recruitment process actually is behind closed doors. Everything you always wanted to know, being a little mouse in the committee. We have several professors who kindly agreed to be on this panel. They will share their experience in recruiting PhD, postdocs, professors at their university, and we really thank them. Of course, they're not going to disclose any personal or secret information, but it's really interesting to have a view on what's happening really on the work floor. And to prepare this conversation, before the event, we actually asked early career researchers to put forward questions that matter to them. Maybe some of them are in the room and they'll be able to ask a question during the Q&A session later. Otherwise, we will put them forward for them. First, I'm gonna introduce the panelists. We have Karin Michiels, a professor of biology at Namur Research Institute for Life Science from Université de Namur, and also senior researchers in animal cellular biology. She's also vice rector for research, president of Euraxis piloting committee, and other governance bodies of the university. We also have Wouter Daams, professor and vice dean for education at the Faculty of Applied Engineering in the Universiteit Antwerpen. He teaches electronics, performs research on sensor and signal processing systems. He worked in a very gendered, unbalanced environment and is constantly trying to turn this tide. Véronique Vitry is associated professor at the Université de Mons. Her research interests are related to surface treatment, physical metallurgy and corrosion, and she teaches process-related classes in metallurgy and materials. She sits on several professional committees, including one on inclusion, diversity, equity, and awareness. Last but not least, we have Luc Geurts, Associate Professor at the E-Media Research Lab of Group T, KU Leuven, and it's a group of professors and researchers investigating human-centered system for healthcare, learning, arts, and entertainment. Important for today's event, Luc is also gender vanguard of the Faculty Assessment Committee. And again, we're sorry to mention that our fifth panelist had to declare that she's on a sick leave. So we would have loved to have also Tatiana Parak-Vogt, who's professor of inorganic chemistry at KU Leuven, and she's also a member of BeWiSe steering committee. In the previous session, the panelists will have a limited time to do their intervention because we want to leave a lot of room for the Q&A. I know it's very frustrating, but we'll have time for you to answer questions. I have my horrible card in case you risk going overboard, and you have about 6 to 7 minutes each. I would like to start with Karin. So Karin, you have the floor to present the recruitment process as you experience it and how you think it's possible to ensure or improve gender fair and diversity practices. Karin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I will not explain how I undergo it. I will explain how we do it now, because mine was a few years ago already. So Namur has the access label, so it means that we need to express on the website everything regarding the career of researchers. And I've put 2 snapshots of the internet site of the University of Namur, which shows how it is explained on the website regarding the career. And it includes the recruitment. I will come back to that later, but also several other issues that are interesting for researchers. This is the snapshot for young researchers, so master students, PhD, and postdocs. And then the next one, please, regards, next slide, please. No, okay. And so the other one was for teletrack, but it goes the same way. So next, please. And for recruitment, we follow the OTMR policy from the European Community. So it means open, transparent, merit-based recruitment. We have 3 procedures for PhD student recruitment, assistant, postdoc researchers, and of course the new track. So the first position is assistant professor. And for that, the procedure includes what to publish for the job offer, what it should contain regarding criteria for selection, the composition of the selection committee, a form from the human research department that explains how the selection committee interviewed the candidates and how they have selected the one. And then there is a validation of the report by the human research department. This is done locally for postdocs and PhD and assistants, but it is done more formally for assistant professor. And the next one. So I did explain a little bit in more details for assistant professor. So this is strictly, I would say, strictly detailed. So everyone has to follow exactly the same procedure. Of course, we have to follow a policy regarding gender, and in the selection committee, it should contain at least 1/3 of women. Of course, 1/3 of men in the other cases, but it is, of course, not so often that it occurs. We have also decided at the University of Namur that the selection committee for tenure track people has to include 2 experts from outside the university to ensure that diversity is respected. And these 2 experts also makes us possible to achieve 1/3 of women in certain disciplines like informatics or physics, which is not so easy to have women from inside. So in that case, the 2 experts from outside can help to balance gender. So the composition of the commission is really strict, and it helps to ensure diversity. And then there is a two-step procedure. First, the selection committee analyzes all the application, and as I heard a little bit earlier this afternoon, the selection committee does not know the names before everything is closed. So the first step is to select the eligible candidates for oral interview, and then the second step is the interviews. They are strictly similar for all the candidates regarding both the content and the time. This is really important, and of course, all the members of the committee have to attend all the interviews. If one cannot attend everything, then it has to be relieved from the job. And usually it lasts 1 hour and a half, 2 hours, and it contains a presentation of the candidate, a presentation of the project and teaching, the research and teaching project, and of course Q&A. And then afterwards, the selection committee has to write a report which describes how the interviews were occurred and on which criteria the candidate has been selected, and with a table that compare each criteria for all the candidates. So it is really well detailed and well to ensure that everyone is considered the same way. So this is the procedure, and now a few figures. Next, please. So this is actually the numbers for the University of Namur. From the 3 last years, we have recruited 14 people and 55 were women. So this is good, I think. But as the other speakers of this afternoon said, there is a women in operation during the career. And you see that from assistant professor, associate professor to full professors, there is less and less women. But I hope that since now we are recruiting more women than men, and because we have also put in place really strict procedure for promotion, including the DORA declaration, so it means that not only about bibliometrics numbers are taken into account, but all the achievements. We hope that it will go better and better over the years. We did the same thing for the enrollment of PhD students. As you see, the last year we have recruited 62 PhD students, 48 of them were women, so this is nice. So not only they are recruited, but they get diplomas. So you see the numbers of diplomas for the last year, but also over the 4 last years, and the proportion of women were higher than 55%. So I think this is really good. At least at the PhD level, there is quite of a good gender balance. And last slide shows specific measures that we are putting in place for ensuring gender balance. Of course, like all of the other universities, we have a gender equality plan that has been accepted by the board of the administration. There is a person in charge of gender who participates with the other persons in charge from the other university to a working group. We have anti-harassment policy and also a kind of guichet to help people complain about harassment or aggression. And then what makes me really my life easier during my career is the daycare. Of course, not no longer now, but when I had a child, it's the nursery for children, which is available to all the members of the university. But it's not only a nursery for young babies, but also a daycare after school up to 8 years. So this is really useful because it is within the university. There are young lady or young men who are going to take the children from the school, putting them to daycare up to 6 hours in the late evening. So this is really useful. And there is also a childcare service at home for sick children. I think this is one, but at least in my point of view, this is really a good. I also one thing. I think this is really a measure that helps women from the cabinet. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Catherine. I think what's really interesting is indeed the figures are quite hopeful, but also to see that some measures are really very pragmatic. They look very simple, but maybe there are laws that works best. Like you mentioned, the childcare, but also the fact of having external experts to bring diversity in the panels, because we often hear it's too difficult, we cannot achieve the 1/3, 2/3, or the 40, 60%, but indeed if you can invite external panels, then it's not an excuse anymore. Thank you, thanks a lot. We're gonna move back, we're gonna move to the University of Antwerp. So Walter, please, you have the words.
Okay, I'd like to show you an insight on our selection procedure. First slide. So this is a table that shows you, let's say, a number of criteria that need to be fulfilled to in a selection process. You see different columns in the table. The left is the research professor, then you have a professor, and then you have the assisting postdocs, postdocs, PhDs, and then the BAP are the researchers which are employed just on an industry contract, so not on mandate. And so what you see is that all those researchers that are directly employed on projects, then the job offer is a public job offering, right? So it needs to be published. Gender neutrality is required, which means that maximum 2/3 of the committee can be of the same gender. How that translates to non-binary, I'm not yet sure. There's some good questions I have. But again, you see that for the researchers that are employed directly on projects, there is no greatly compelling rule that says that the selection committee needs to be gender or needs to be gender neutral, right? The university asks to be diligent, but it happens that the selection committees are male and probably also all female in some faculties. The selection committee is broad on the left side and gets narrower when you go to the right side. So for research professors, there's a chair of the research council, the deputy chair of the research council, the dean, the research group leader, and then 3 external experts and 2 internal experts. And that broad composition also allows to make gender balance, makes it realistic. For the non-research professors, so the ordinary professors, usually it's a team, 2 external experts, which is very comparable to the case in Hamburg, 1 non-faculty member, and then 3 extra members which need to guard the 3 core tasks, so education, research, and services. When it comes to postdocs and PhDs, then the selection committee is limited to 3 persons, the unit head, the promoter, and another faculty member. Okay. Next slide. And now I have 3 slides which show you the entire process of selecting a professor. It's not to impress you, but it's just very complex. There's 3 lines in the diagram. The left one is for research professors who are paid by the research fund of the university. The middle is the ordinary track, and the right track is a special track in case that the personnel plan did not contain that position. And it's only different in the first step, in the sense that in that case the bureau of the faculty needs to approve to open that position. You see on the very right of the slide, you see that we start at T minus 12 months, which means it takes a year to hire a professor. And then the first step is to compose a job offering, to appoint a selection committee, and also to define a search strategy, because in our line of work it's very difficult to find professors in some disciplines, and therefore you really need to think about how you're going to recruit people. Okay, and the next step is that combo of the job offering, the selection committee, and the search strategy is submitted to the faculty council. And for a research professor, there's a track through all the university research councils. For the middle track, it's only going to the executive council of the university. In fact, it should be the board of directors, but they delegated it to the executive council. And the conclusion is that 3 months later, we can publish a job offering. Okay, next slide. Now that needs to be 2 months online. So the job opening is open for 2 months. And then hopefully a lot of people apply. And based on the applications which have been submitted by those people on the left of the slide, and also based on bibliographic profiles, so we do a search on how these people performed in the past. Based on those 2 criteria, the searching committee makes a pre-selection. And then we are out here before the start of the employment. Remain out of that selection, and these have to be interviewed by the selection committee. They all need to write a research plan, and so the research plan is discussed during the interviews. And then from the left, every professor also needs to give a trial coach live for students, so they get the topic assigned a few days before the class takes place. So they need to prepare it in a few days, and they need to show themselves also for teaching. And based on that information, and also a more extensive bibliographic profile, and also a big matrix. We have a performance matrix, which we also use for promotions. Boxes get ticked and numbers get counted. And based on the entire process, the selection committee selects a number of people, which are indicated in green. In a sense, they make a ranking. And the green people are above the line, and the rest are below the line. The difference is, if you're above the line, then the order is the order in which the jobs will be offered. And if the first person declines, then it will be offered to the second person, and so on. If you're below the line, you will never get a job, right? And you failed the hiring process. Can I go on back, please?
Sorry.
Yeah.
You'll have to wrap up in 1 minute.
Yeah, no problem. The result of that is a selection report, and either the indication whether it will be a tenure track process or whether it's really a great proposal. If you have a very tenured professor, which you have from another university, then there will be a great proposal as well. And then we're 4 months before start. Yeah, next one. Okay, and then it goes back through a number of councils, the faculty council or the research council if it's a research professor, and then again to the executive committee, and then a year later we start. And then the final thing is that 1 month after the start there is a goal setting meeting, usually with the dean, with the unit heads, and then let's say the goals are set for the next period before evaluation. Now this is the process for professorship. If you have a postdoc application or PhD application, of course the procedure is linear and short. For a postdoc, typically 6 to 7 months. For an assistant or PhD position, 3 to 4 months, something like that. And that concludes.
Thank you very much, Monte. I think it's really interesting to see also indeed the complexity. I'm sure there are many good reasons for it and safeguarding the fairness and the transparency of the process, but it's interesting also to see that yes, for people who recruit, it's also a big job and a big task to undertake. We're going to stay in faculties and disciplines with underrepresentation of female researchers and give the floor to Veronique. So Veronique from University de Mons, you have the floor.
Thank you. I didn't make slides and I'm very happy about that because I would probably have said exactly the same as the others. Because to recruit a professor, associate professor or something like that, we mostly all have the same procedures. I've got exactly the same matrix as well to do that in our university. there's one interesting difference is that in every panel we've got the dean and his vice dean of faculty, and then every head of department for which the person will be involved. And also two external people are sitting on the committee, and in the University of Mons, usually the gender balance comes from the dean because half of our deans are female. So it helps a lot. And mostly in engineering, because at the moment we've got a woman dean and a woman vice dean. So just with them both, we are sure that we have a fair representation. We also have a specific process that maybe a lot of universities don't have. It's the permanent scientific position. And that's internal recruitment from the assistants that can be promoted to actually some sort of tenured assistant. And it's exactly the same process as for the associate professor, except you don't have to give the lesson. That's really the only difference. But you've got to go in front of all the head of departments from all the departments actually. So it's even a little bit more daunting because there's more head of departments than if you were applying as a professor. And and it takes exactly as much time from the time we imagine a position can be opened to the time it is filled. Sometimes even a little bit more, because it's in some fields like in IT, it's the things are evolving so quickly. They need to think about what will we include as topics, etc. And it can take really long time. So if you think someone is retiring and you don't see a position open, don't be afraid. It will arrive sometime. It just takes time to do that kind of thing. And if you want to know what it makes, how it is to sit and to be the one interview, I'm an expert. I've been through this, I think, 6 or 7 times in the last 10 years, so you can really ask anything you want. And as for the more junior positions, except for the teaching assistants, where it's also an official selection by the faculty, all the rest is in the hands of the PI. And we need to do what we can. Personally, I've got a grade with interview questions, and I try to follow it for all the candidates, but I really cannot say what my colleagues are doing in other departments. And I think that's most of the similarities and differences.
Thanks a lot, Veronique. I'm sure some people will ask you a question, maybe not in the Q&A sessions, but then during the coffee break. It's really interesting also to see that at your university half of the deans are female. I think it's quite an achievement, and not all universities can say that yet. So that's really good to see. You may also have noticed that for our event, we wanted to have gender diverse panels. I know there are differences of views with this, but really we think that the topic is of interest for everybody. It's not only for female researchers or female professors. So we're really happy to have also a gender balance panel of speakers. Now is the turn to Luc, who might tell us a little bit more about what it is to be a gender vanguard, and maybe share other practices to contribute to more gender balanced. You have the floor, Luc.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just wondering now, am I the only gender vanguard in this room? Or do other universities have a gender vanguard? I'm not sure. Perhaps I should first clarify this role. So I'm one of the members of the evaluation committee. I'm going to focus specifically on hiring professors in what I'm going to tell you now. When I became a member of that evaluation committee, there was this initiative from the university to have a gender and diversity vanguard in every team. And they were looking for volunteers, and I raised my hand, but I didn't know yet what to do. My first thoughts was that I would be responsible to activate an alarm when someone would say something that might be a sign of prejudice or implicit bias. But through the years, I have learned what can be done. It's actually a work in progress, that's what I can say. I think we're not there yet, there's still a lot needs to happen. But what I would like to share with you is what we've learned in the past years, and some of these things are based on scientific research. We are researchers, aren't we? So one of the things that I've learned is that when I, as a member in the assessment committee, I see the last 4 candidates. So I'm responsible for selecting who of these 4 will become a professor or who will be ranked at the 2nd place. But that's quite late in the process. I've learned that you have to start much sooner. It starts already when you think of the profile of the professor you are looking for. Who do we want in our team? Who do we want on our campus and our faculty? And we've learned, for instance, that if you make that profile very specific, there will be not many candidates, and as a result, also not many women candidates. So we've learned that we should not make that too specific, because if you have a lot of criteria, then people will start doing self-selection. And research says that women researchers tend to be more selective. They do more self-selection. So what we have learned is start with writing a vacancy and try to keep it open. Try to keep it broad. Then you attract more candidates, and as a consequence, also more female candidates. A second thing we've learned is the text of the vacancy. Which words are you going to use? Also, that makes a difference. Also, there have been scientific studies on the way you phrase or the way you use to describe the vacancies that has an impact. Some words are perceived as more masculine and other words are perceived as more feminine. That's a fact, there's scientific evidence from that. And if you have a vacancy with a lot of words that have a strong masculine connotation, then you will have less female candidates. On the other hand, if you have a text with a lot of words that have female connotations, male candidates will still apply. So what you should do is indeed look for that. And there is a tool, actually, there is a website, the Gender Decoder, where you can check your text. For instance, one of the words that I don't allow anymore, because as a gender vanguard, I'm allowed to have a look at the texts before they are published. And if I see the word excellence, I ask to leave it out. Not because female research cannot be excellent, but because I think that excellence is not the responsibility of an individual. As an institute, you want to be excellent. As a team, you want to be excellent. But if an individual is excellent, then you expect that person to be better than others. And that's not what we want. We don't want people who are all better than all the rest, because that's even impossible. So there are some strong words that are actually not saying that much, that are just left out of our vacancy texts. Then we go to the next phase. The vacancy is published. We have a search committee at our university. So for every vacancy, we have a few professors, 3 to 4 professors, who are asked to look for candidates actively. They are our headhunters, you could say. Because we should be aware that not everyone wants to work at A11 or at a university. You have to make sure that people have the impression that this is a nice place to be. And I remember that in the past, people were quite passive in the way they search for candidates. They just forwarded to their network. But now we really ask them. I make a phone call with every search committee. I really ask them, go after these people, go to Google Scholar, send them an email, invite them for a conversation and so on. Because that way, I also think that you, for instance, prevent that there will be self-selection. So they have to actively search for good candidates and promote that we are a nice employer. Sorry. And then finally, we have the pre-selection. Also there, I'm involved now, and if there is a female candidate at the 5th place, as I said before, we invite 4 people. Then I ask for additional motivation. Why did you do so? Then the final stage, do I still have time? Because I'm not, okay. Just an anecdote that I want to share, because implicit bias is actually a really dirty thing. That was one of the things that I had to learn, we all had to learn. I remember that there once was a female candidate for a professorship, and she was highly pregnant. And she stood there, well, in all her glory with her pregnancy, and at the end there was a discussion whether she had leadership qualities. And it was literally asked to her, and we could not find, between quotes, we could not find leadership qualities. We had the impression that she was just doing the tasks that her supervisor asked her to do. But actually, that was really in one of the first years when I was in that community, and I did not know how to react. But actually, I've learned afterwards that none of us knew what leadership was. We are all professors in engineering disciplines. We are not HR managers. None of us knew. We had some vague ideas what leadership was. So from then on, we said, okay, first we have to agree on what leadership is. What are these qualities? And it turns out that you need people who take initiative, but that can show empathy, that can be a good coach. So there are a lot of qualities that are actually not male at all. So from now on, when we look for leadership qualities, we know what specific aspects we need to look for. And I'm happy that because 2 years later, the same candidate came for another vacancy, and she was #1, and she's now a member of our faculty. So I wanted to end with that good news.
We were eager to know what the gender word was, and I think now we know a little bit, and it's really interesting. I think, yes, it's inspiring and indeed work in progress, because sometimes, you don't react in the right way immediately, but it's also self-reflection and indeed scientific research into what works and what doesn't work. So now is the time for, almost the time for first event. Okay, first the time for the question and answers. So, yes, I'm happy to see that the early career scientists in the room are ready to ask their questions.
Yes, so a lot of that mentioned non-binary, and he wasn't sure yet how to deal with that in the selection procedure. So I appreciate that honesty really, but it made me think about how little is being said about non-binary, and that a lot of the anecdotes and explanations that we've heard talk about he, she, or female, male, and we don't have a lot of, well, nobody really mentioned non-binary, but it's about gender recruitment, and gender isn't just female, male. So I was wondering what your take on that would be.
Go ahead, yeah. Whoever wants to start.
Okay. So, to be honest, I just recently have heard about it. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago that we had a postdoc position in our lab, and we had a non-binary person who filled in the vacancy, and that was the first time that I learned about it. In the meantime, I've learned more and more about it. I think we should not really promote just only female candidates. What you want is diversity. And that, of course, includes also non-binary people in your organization. I think what you can do is just have a general neutral process. So that's what we should strive for, not a process that favors any gender, but that it's just gender neutral. Because irrespective of the gender, you should choose for the candidate who's the most fit. I don't say the best candidate, I say the candidate who has the best fit. So we are really learning about how you can have a gender neutral process, but also how you can make your environment inclusive. And that's also things, again, it's work in progress, we need to learn about it.
I also had a question for you, Dirk, because you mentioned that for the vacancy you often try to make them less specific so you can attract more candidates. And I know that the selection procedures you all described are very elaborate and very long. And I know that if certain groups want a specific person to become professor, they often make the vacancy super specific. And then you have this super long procedure, but actually everybody knows who is going to be beforehand. So I really like the fact that you try to limit them, the specifications. And is it something that you do then for everybody or only? Yeah.
Yeah, also because we are quite young faculty, because in 2013 we became part of K11. So we don't have that tradition yet of having very large, big, successful research groups where you have a lot of postdocs that have the potential to grow as a professor. So most of the people we hire in the past years come from outside. So, and actually we don't allow that a vacancy is written to the profile of someone you have in mind. We just don't allow that.
Yeah.
I would like to learn from other
I think we do the same thing. Very open position, at least for tenure track. Of course, not for postdocs, because there we need a fit in between the research project and the people. But for tenure track, it is really open, and mostly it is without any idea who would be hired. So this is really important, and not to have inbreeding.
Yeah.
Yes, we have some of the same things, and actually when there's a teaching position open, the only things that are listed are the classes that the person will have to take over, but and a word to say that the research should be in line with what is done in the lab or department, but nothing more. There's no precision on the research. It's left completely open so that someone from outside can come with his or her own research.
I agree that there's a spectrum from, let's say, a very specific way of writing a vacancy when it's for PhD students, because of the project. You have something to be executors, you know your students, so you can appoint a student to the project. While if you go towards hiring a professor, I think the tendency is to hire very broad. I'd like to come back to the first question regarding how I would see that we incorporate the non-binary way of thinking into our hiring procedure. And I think how we cope with gender neutrality in the sense that we require a maximum 2/3 of the selection committee to be of the same gender was the first attempt of the legislator and also the universities to cope with that fact. The bad thing is it doesn't scale. If you add classes to that spectrum, you can't have a selection committee which is proportionally composed. So I believe we'll have to work with scrutinizing ourselves to avoid bias, to avoid these gender non-neutral way of wording. Yeah. So I think we'll be on a different way than just counting and working with percentages. And that's a challenge.
Thank you. I have some questions for Karin and Veronique. My first question for Karin is, do you know some factors that are behind the fact that 75% women start a PhD and then only 23% end up as a professor? Do you know any?
75, it was 50?
No, 57, yeah, sorry. And then 23% ends up as a professor. Because
But it's not end up now. It is because full professors are old. So they have been hired, not like me. I mean, they have been hired 30 years ago when this was not balanced at all already at PhD level. That's why I say there is hope, because now on the PhD point of view, there is a gender balance which is still half and half, so this is good, both for hiring and ending, so ending diploma, because this is also very important to follow, to be sure that it's not only beginning a PhD, but having the diploma at the end. And then for tenure track recruitment, now we, at least a new number from the 3 last year, it is gender balance. And we hope that afterwards, so the promotion from associate professor to assistant professor and then full professor in 15 years, then the gender balance will be achieved. But it will take time, okay?
Okay, thank you.
And as for me, it would be very difficult to answer because I come from a very gender unbalanced faculty, which is engineering. We've got 20% female students. We've got 15% female professors, and we've got 50% female PhD students. So there's some sort of balance between students and professors because, okay, the numbers are not exactly the same, but if there was one more female professors who would be at the same level, and most of the female professors are actually a little bit on the young side of the spectrum. I think the oldest of us is she's less than 55. So there's nobody in the older part. And actually a lot of the PhD students that we have and that are female are not engineers. And maybe this is why we don't have the best professors in our faculty, or I don't know, but it's difficult to explain for me.
There are a few questions on the back of the room. Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought it was very interesting that you have the anti-harassment policy at your university. But I was wondering, is it external or is it with members that are part of your institution?
Harassment policy?
The anti-harassment policy.
It's both. But for the complaint, Michel, it is expressed for external because otherwise people will not complain.
Hello, my name is Shahina Zajar. I finished my PhD from Catholic University of Leuven, and after that I went back to my country. I have a Belgian nationality and also Palestinian, and I was there as an assistant professor for 5 years. I got an associate professor promotion. Now, if I want to apply for a position at the university, do you take in consideration the promotion that I got as an associate professor, or do I need to go through the whole process of getting an associate professor position?
Maybe I can just answer just a very short answer for the French part. There is what we call the grade d'engagement, which means at which position we can hire PhD holder, so a person.
Yeah.
So in the French part, we can hire a person as assistant professor or full professor. It is not allowed from the law to hire a person as associate professor. So in the French community, it will not be possible. But it is not our, it is legal. We cannot do anything about that.
But it's possible to have some sort of seniority, financial, and there is always some sort of fast track promotion for people that get hired.
Yes.
We have that mostly for people that had a career at the FNRS before, and they get recruited as professors usually later because they had that permanent position, and then there's a vacancy in the department they work with, and they're obvious candidates, and sometimes they are recruited. I've got a friend that got recruited in September, I think it's 53. So he's an associate professor, but I think in 1 or 2 years he will be a full professor because you can benefit from fast track promotion.
At Leuven, we can hire people at the associate professor level and professor level. Actually, in our vacancy, we don't mention in which level we will hire the person. It's left open. So it depends on the candidate. So someone 3 to 5 years after PhD will start on a tenure track typically, but someone who is already associate professor at another university, and it regularly happens, they typically also start or continue to be an associate professor and then they can promote after a few years to professor or full professor.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Annelie Mortier. I'm from Ghent University and ECO. First of all, thank you for shedding some light on your selection and recruitment strategies in your university. Just have a question or multiple questions on the criteria. How do you define them? Do you make a distinction between nice to have, must have? Is there a difference between the weights of the criteria and how are they evaluated? Thank you.
I can start on that with an entire table, and let's say 5 to 6 years ago, we coped with that table in a very numerical way, in the sense that we scored the table, we had weights, and we added them, and our experience is that that does not work. So what we do is we still use the table as a reference framework, such that we get an idea on how the candidate scores on different aspects. But then it's mainly based on the interview, research plan, the interaction with the candidates, and then, well, it's a trade-off. It becomes a little bit more fuzzy, because the advantage of the table and the weights is that it's very transparent. But it turns out not to select the right candidates. Because indeed, there are also issues of how well someone would fit into a group. And that's not easily translated into a table. So we are going away from the purely numerical averaging of all scores. There is a kind of a distinction between nice to have and must have, in the sense that the table stems from our promotion process. And in the promotion process, we make a distinction between competencies and attributes that the candidate should have for the associate professor level, for the full professor level. So that's the distinction.
The same, we have a must have, and then we have to take the box, otherwise no way. And then must have, but we have the must have compared the similar way for all the candidates.
We also have criteria, and actually we communicate them to the candidates who are invited for the interview. And many of these are actually not countable. I think there are a lot of things that you cannot measure in a number, like how the way you fit to the vacancy or to the profile, how complementary are you to the group, how are your teaching qualities, because again, you cannot put that in a number. So of course there are things you can count, number of publications, amount of money you have achieved, but that's only one thing. That's definitely not the thing we base our ranking on.
Yeah, and I'd say in our university, to know every promotion was based on 3 criteria, which was research, teaching, and service with numbered values on them. So it was I think 50% research, 30 teaching, and 20 service. And they actually are in the process of removing that. And it's starting this year for the full professors, because those positions are open this year, and then to go down, it will trickle down, because actually it doesn't work. Because some people get more invested in research, and other and don't do any service, and other are more into service, and okay, you cannot be 100% everywhere, and this is what was asked mostly of people. So it's a little bit of the same. It's not countable.
Next question, yes, please go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. I'm Dia from Ghent University. I was wondering if there is a follow-up evaluation on the professors, because in my experience, I have a lot of professors excellent on the scientific level, but not as leaders. And I think a lot of PhDs are going through burnouts or like mental problems. And I think part of the responsibility is on the professor as well. And maybe that lacks a bit of empathy or help in this. So I was wondering if after some years there is a follow-up, maybe speaking with the members of the group to evaluate the professor on this aspect.
When you get hired at the University of Mons as entry-level professor, you get an evaluation period, so the tenure track, and at the end of that, you are evaluated. Then you are evaluated again each time you ask for a promotion, but not in between.
And not afterwards.
And not afterwards.
In Flanders, there's a rule that every 5 years you need to be evaluated. And the system is such that at the first under par evaluation, which you score, you don't reach the required level, you get kind of an improvement track imposed on you. You take some action, guided action. And if the second time you don't meet your criteria again, then you are fired. And we had in our university. We also had people who, after the 5-year tenure track period, were not continued on fire because they didn't fit or they didn't comply with the expectations of the students regarding teaching quality, for example.
We have only time for one more question, but please go ahead. And there will be time to ask informally also during the break.
Yes, linking up with my name is Nadia from KU Leuven. Linking up with the last question, I've been in the selection committees, audit committees, and recently also the evaluation committee. And I know there are severe follow-ups and evaluations, but I still wonder if this suggestion that has recently been made about how a person functions in his immediate research group, what the opinion is of the people he's supposed to lead, is sufficiently taken into account. I noticed that in the evaluation committee, for instance, the number of publications is an issue, the evaluations by the students. But I think this element of leadership, which is very timely, and the question also discussing the harassment aspect, would be a great idea to also take into account in some way.
Yeah, I subscribe to that. It's not a 360-degree evaluation, and maybe it should be. It's not. I imagine that, for example, the quality of coaching students might not be sufficiently taken into account. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, last one. It depends, let's say, on the jury, which is on the committee, to express maybe doubts on the quality, and that happens. But that depends on the composition of that committee. So if there are people in the committee who are closely involved and know that a person is not functioning well, they can mention during the evaluation. But if everyone stays silent, then there's nothing happening.
Yeah, but a PhD student will never go at that.
No, but very often problems with PhD students are also perceived by professors who are nearby. You also have your IDC, we call that IDC, which is the internal doctoral committee. So you can go to the chairman of that committee to complain about your promoter and to say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't feel well guided. Can you do something about that? Yeah. Also to the owners person. Also
Okay, I'd like to thank all our panelists and all the audience. Thanks a lot. I'm going to invite you all to the coffee and tea break. It's just outside on the left. And please come back at 3:45, so 15:45. And in the meantime, ask any additional question you wish.
Yeah, necessary. And my faculty to be able to help with their results. The one of them who talked about the name and the also by the professors. But I wonder. Yeah, I wonder how blind it is because they can see, they have to see on your resume where you did your PhD and your, so they can see that it's me if I'm applying for a relationship at a big Thank you for saying so much for me. Appreciate it.
Ja, ik ben eigenlijk significant van jullie aan de aan het kijken, behalve dat dat is bij HR.
Dat is een copy-paste dat je doet. De top van die vandaag van oktober, die is in proces, dus dat is heel waar.
Ja, dat is veel stil. Ah ja.
Dat is een copy-paste dat je doet. Soms moet je bij een aanvragen en je kan zeggen dat je denkt van, we gaan samen iets complementair niet onder de
Ja, dat is heel belangrijk. Dat is nu criterium.
Die op de toestemming moet voortgaan.
Diese box. Ik kom naar wel, dat wordt van dat naam. Ook die dus voor dus maken met de Hallo, dag Beatrice.
Ik ben de laatste.
Ja. De laatste zijn.
Ja, we zullen heel veel concluderen, denk ik, want het is al een onderzoek van ja.
Mag ik ook eventjes een klein statement van jullie?
Een statement?
Dus
niet voorbereid.
Nee, maar niemand heeft iets voorbereid. Dus gewoon eventjes kort jezelf voorstellen en zeggen wat je gaat bijdragen.
Gaan we misschien samen meteen?
Maar misschien voorstellen, ik zie dat je het zelf aan je tas hebt.
Ja.
Ah, oké.
Maar hoe heb je hier?
Of wil jij even aan het toilet anders?
Ja, ik denk het niet.
Ja, oké, dat is goed. Ja.
It's very nice.
That's nice. Yeah. It's very dynamic.
You all of these notes.
I expected we had 100 registrations. Well, the people that are here and it's also Swedish, so I think it's really nice. But also, people are very.
They also provide to be sometimes these kind of problems. I listen to this.
I'm not here to discuss this. You would have like organize a channel in Is er hier voor ons in de discussie? Ja, we hebben ja, ja. I don't guess basically Dat is hier een afsluiting. Dit is hier goed, hè? Ja. Is dat klopt? Is dat deze ding?
Kan ik jullie twee samen?
Ja. Wat is dat een linkerkant?
Linkerkant.
Wat is het standpunt? Ah, ik buiten. Dat zijn door alle buiten. Ja.
Zij gaan hem even... Ah ja. Ja, de onderste. Ja. Oh, dit zijn mij hebben niet gegeven.
Okay, thank you for coming back to the last session of our 2022 Women in Science Day. So now is the time for two inspiring talks by three inspiring women who will share their perspective, their ambitions, tips and tricks for gender fair recruitment in academia. I'm gonna introduce them, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them, the three of them at once, so that we don't interrupt after that. First speaker will be Carrie Herjade, Program Manager at the Dutch Research Council NWO, which was already mentioned early on in the first session. This is the Nederlandse Organisatie voor Wetenschappelijk Onderzoek. She coordinates the scientific evaluation and the follow-up of projects in social sciences and humanities. She promotes NWO's inclusive assessment initiative, and we are very eager to know more about this approach. The next two speakers will talk together, and it's going to be a conversation between Beatrice van Acker, Assistant Professor of French Literature and Translation Science at KU Leuven, and Birgit van Puynbroek, Assistant Professor Literature in English and Research Methodology at the VUB. Both are members of the Jonge Academie and very committed to themes related to gender and diversity. And they will make a joint presentation. Let us start with Carrie. You have the floor.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me. I'm so happy to share a little something about NWO's inclusive assessment policy. Let's see how this clicker works.
The other, yeah.
Yes, there we go. So first of all, NWO as an organization strives to have an inclusive culture, both for their employees, but also for our granting policy, because our core business as a FWO and FNRS is granting scientific research, but then in the Netherlands. So I'd like to zoom in on our granting policy. So some of our efforts in NWO to make this more inclusive have been, for example, balanced composition of our boards and committees. We also undersigned the DORA declaration, which was mentioned already a couple of times. We're experimenting with having narrative CVs in our application forms so that there's more space and freedom for diverse types of research output. We have incentive grants, for example, for women in STEM, and also the Mosaic scheme was already mentioned. And we're striving to have inclusive procedures and funding instruments. So really trying to create a level playing field for everyone. And part of that is specifically our inclusive assessment initiative. So why did we start this? It's not that we were doing really bad, but I guess our marks in terms of gender balance were comparable with the numbers that we've already seen from the other two research funding organizations. So really the aim is how can we do better? It's difficult to look at diversity because I realize for myself personally, inclusivity is not just looking at gender, it's way beyond that, but like in our application system, it's sometimes really difficult to filter out all these elements. So for sure, what we did look at was gender, and we could see there was some to improve there. So our focus is optimizing our assessment process, really to reduce the undesired effects of unconscious bias in the assessment of grant applications. So we asked experts' advice, so they did a really comprehensive study, looked at a lot of research, and also watched a lot of the training material that is already available, especially for assessment processes. So they delivered to us two parts. One part being a plan for the design and creation of a training video for our reviewers and committee members, and part B, an overview of other proven effective additional measures that we could put in place in our procedures. So this resulted in two videos, really focused on reducing the undesired effect of unconscious bias. One video was for our written assessment procedures, so that's for our external reviewers, but also for our committee members doing a written review. And the second video especially focused on assessment in committee meetings, which focuses on group dynamics and specifically on evaluating interviews and presentations by applicants. So both videos contain practical tips and tools and are focused on broadening the often ideal image of what a good researcher of good research is. So we will check out the video in a bit and then I will share more about it. Here you can see two screenshots of the video, and you can see that we used an abstract style, and we did this on purpose because we did not want to repeat and thereby reinforce existing stereotypes. So I propose to watch the video now, and there's some technical things that need to happen in order to do that.
The Dutch Research Council wants to advance research with both scientific and societal impact. Therefore, research needs to be conducted by people with all kinds of different experiences. A diverse range of perspectives enables innovative and creative research. That is why the Dutch Research Council is always on the lookout for suitable applicants and consortia to carry out this research. Our evaluators play a vital role in this quest. In this video, the Dutch Research Council calls attention to the evaluation process. Evaluators implicitly construct a frame of reference that an applicant should fit based on aspects that differ, for example, a discipline or research program. This frame is currently rather one-sided, which results in a limited ideal image for suitable applicants. This ideal image is implicit, but also normative. We are therefore more inclined to choose an applicant who better fits this ideal image over somebody who fits it less well. This determines who is considered to be suitable and who is not. For example, we have an ideal image about what a scientific career should look like, but it can also look like this, or like this. We should keep asking ourselves, will our limited frame of reference actually lead to research with impact? To further improve the assessment process, we should let ourselves be less guided by a one-sided ideal image. In order to do so, this ideal image needs to be made explicit and should be expanded during the assessment process. Now, let's consider several concrete ways of doing this. When the selection committee comes together, group dynamics are crucial. Such dynamics may bring about challenges that lead to a suboptimal assessment. Therefore, agree upon the meeting structure and code of conduct within the committee prior to the assessment. For example, agree upon the same amount of speaking time for every committee member and alternate between who speaks first. Pay attention to this throughout the entire meeting. Similar agreements should also be made for the group discussion about the proposals and applicants. Are the criteria provided by the Dutch Research Council clear for everyone? What is the weighting of each criteria, and how will the criteria be interpreted and possibly compensated? Make this explicit together so that you are not subconsciously led by a one-sided ideal image. Agree to be alert to biased language, such as language influenced by ideal images, which will result in one proposal gaining an advantage over another. Such agreements help to create a group dynamic in which everyone can be held accountable if the main agreements are deviated from. An interview or presentation can be part of the assessment process. For this, also agree on a clear structure in advance. That means discussing together which topics must be addressed and who poses which questions. Make notes and take the agreed upon criteria into account. Limit your assessment to the content provided by the applicant. Avoid taking irrelevant characteristics or informal interactions into account. Use your notes as a basis for your contribution during the committee meeting. Also, when presentations and interviews are discussed, be aware of biased language or arguments that are not relevant for the assessment. Hold each other accountable if that happens. Spend an equal amount of time on discussing each application, and don't just motivate why proposals fail to meet the criteria, but also make sure to motivate why they do meet the criteria. Finally, never discuss proposals and applicants with other committee members outside of the formal meeting. These were some concrete ways to improve the assessment process. Science with impact requires different perspectives. Let us expand our frame of reference together to make room the assessment process for a multifaceted image of suitable applicants. That's how we work together towards innovative and creative research.
Yes, so that was a video on group dynamics, and we watched this video before every assessment meetings, and I know it's a lot of information to take in, so we already asked our committee members to watch it beforehand, and then during the meeting, we take time to really commit to this and actually make agreements based on the tips provided in the video. And we've also created a handout to help them really keep this in mind and hold each other accountable while doing this. So I'm really curious, I'm not going to do a test, but take a minute to breathe and realize, okay, how many tips can I remember? As again, I'm not going to test you. There are 11 tips in total. So here are some of them. And yeah, for example, taking an equal amount of time to discuss each application. These were already things that are, let's say, hard-coded in the design of our assessment meetings. But other things are really new for some of the assessment committee members. So it's good to really call attention to this. So how to implement this video, because of course this was also a learning trajectory for us. We were like, okay, we want to do something, we do a study, we create a video, okay, and now then what do we do? So we created a website which contains all the tips written out with extra information and also the scientific sources. We have this externally available for everyone. And also we have a dedicated intranet page for our colleagues. We have created a handout as well, which I already mentioned, which can be used during the meetings, and it can be downloaded from this website as well. Actually, I have some printouts, I'll put them out so you can take them, and maybe we can share the link somehow. We have a training for our project officers, because of course, yeah, my colleagues, they're the ones who need to stand in front of an assessment committee and really put this to practice and work together with the chair and the committee on how to do this. So we have developed a training for them with the help of external experts, the same who have written this whole report and then did a train the trainer. So now some of my colleagues are also giving this training and sharing this knowledge within our organization. And we are setting up monitoring and evaluation of this whole process. It's quite fresh, the whole rollout, because of course we created the video, we're now training our colleagues, and only when they did the training will they start using it in our assessment committee meeting. So I think, yeah, over time we will start to see what the impact is of this. So to circle back to really the main question of this afternoon, I think I can only speak for NWO's approach, and that is, yeah, we try to optimize our assessment process by providing tools for inclusive assessment as part of a wider effort to create a level playing field for all of our applicants. So that was it for me. I think we'll have questions later on. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Kelly. Thanks a lot. Yes. Thanks for sharing the practice. We're going to have a single question and answer session, not to be too long. One thing that I will certainly remember is the idea of the no one-sided ideal image of a researcher. I think this is really important. And also earlier this week, Anne and I, we took part in a contest for secondary school girls leading in science, and I recognize very well the difficulties of the dynamics of a jury when we have to decide who's going to be the winning team or who are going to be the winning team. So I think this is really very applicable to many situations. I would like to invite you now, Birgit and Beatrice, to give your presentation. If you want to sit and then you have each a microphone, it might be better, or you want to stand, I can give. Okay. You have the floor.
De andere. Ja.
I should see the presentation myself. It's all we can get started anyway, I think. So my name is Birgit van Belbroek. I'm here together with my colleague Beatrice van Akker. We're both members of the Young Academy of Flanders. And with the Young Academy, we launched a campaign in 2019 on implicit gender bias, which is called in Dutch Wetenschap is MVX, so with the X there as well, and to also include people who don't identify with either the M or the V. There seems to be some kind of
Yeah, it's because of the system. We will have to retry it.
Oh my God.
I'm not sure whether everyone here is already familiar with the Young Academy. Some of you might be, but some of you might not be. So the Young Academy is an organization, a network of scientists, young scientists, and also artists. We were founded in 2013, so already a while ago, but at the same time still a young organisation. And we have about 58 members. So each year we recruit 10 new members, and then 10 of the members go away. The membership is for a period of 5 years. And we have an open recruitment, so an open call, anyone who fits the criteria can apply, and we also organise information sessions at a Flemish university, just say a few words about what the Young Academy is, what we do, and whether people think it is something for them as well. With the Young Academy, we work on 4 main domains, and the first one is policy, including gender and diversity policy. The second is science communication. We are also very big on interdisciplinarity, and especially also the relation between art and science. And then our fourth pillar is internationalization, as we work together with academies across Europe, but also with the Global Young Academy and the Young Academy of Europe, and to see how we can bring things to a European level or even a global level, and to also work together on particular issues. Now, what do we want to do today? First of all, we want to give you an overview of some of the gender and diversity initiatives that we have already taken. We want to highlight one of our main achievements, which is the Vir Charter. So this is a gender action plan that was negotiated together with all 5 Flemish universities as part of the Inter-University Council, and together with the Young Academy, or is the abbreviation. We then want to give you some tips and tricks as part of our toolbox. Now, many of these things have already been mentioned, but it might be good to have an overview. But before we do that, we want to show you some recent figures as well, as you might think, well, we're doing very well, but when we look at things on a European level, that might also change a bit our perspective as to where Belgium actually is in a broader context. And then finally, we also look ahead to the future, of course, what's next and what's still in the pipeline for the Young Academy, and where we also very much hope to get your input or to work together on installing new policies in the future. So what are some of the initiatives that we have taken so far? Well, one of the main things was a campaign that we launched in 2019, which was devoted to raising awareness about implicit bias, and especially implicit gender bias. We had posters across campuses, across the 5 universities in Flanders. We had a website, and I'll show it in a bit, with a toolbox on tips and tricks as to how we can counteract bias, because everybody has implicit biases. It's a mechanism in our brain that we use to decode information pretty quickly, to make decisions. Sometimes it helps us, but in particular, in specific situations like recruitment settings, we also start filling in the blanks and start making assumptions without even listening to the candidates or looking at the actual persons and simply using these categorizations. We didn't stop there. So when COVID hit us hard in 2019, 2020, it was becoming clear that criteria were not fitting anymore, that people needed space to also say how COVID was impacting their research, was impacting their careers. And of course, we do not yet know what a long-term or middle-term impact might be of that, right? As especially young academics with responsibilities of care, with loads of teaching, also with small children, men and women, didn't have time for a lot of the really sort of crisis managers in that particular period. And of course, this can still produce long-term effects, as we were not taking any initiatives perhaps during a couple of months that might still have impacts later on. And we shouldn't forget about that in the near future either. It might take some time, right, to recover, and we cannot expect people to sort of immediately fill those gaps, or even, we might also value some of the initiatives that were taken from other fronts than our traditional criteria. And of course, we also get the comment quite often, well, we're focusing on gender quite a lot, but what about other forms of diversity? So we have a working group on diversity in higher education as well. We had the first public event in the fall of 2021, and we're working together with partners with universities, but also with
student representatives, for example, to see how we can come together and really sort of build a platform to put this on the agenda or even higher on the agenda than it already is. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on the implicit gender bias campaign that we had, some of the concrete initiatives that were taken, and also the gender charter that came out of it. So these were the posters that were sort of distributed across campus. I hope that many of you remember these or have seen these. So trying to raise awareness about implicit bias and also trying to inform people. And on each poster there was also a link to our website. And this is the website that is still active that you can visit today or in the near future. So it's www.wetenschap.mvx.be, it's in Dutch, where we have information on what implicit bias is, some of the facts and figures as they were available in 2019, some stories as well as to how this is impacting people in real life level, right, in actual committees, as well as committee members sharing their stories, as we have heard committee members do as well today, as to things that really help and things that they have learned. So stories as well as facts. And then we have the toolbox, which is some concrete tips and tricks. Some of them have already been mentioned. There might be a few extra there too, that Beatrice will also highlight towards the end of the presentation. All of this accumulated and sort of culminated in the Gender Charter that was signed in 2019 by the 5 Flemish universities. And it can be good to sort of briefly revisit this charter to see what was actually agreed on, what were the commitments that each of these universities, the 5 Flemish universities, made, and where are we today, right? What do we need to do to further implement these policies and actions? Because of course the charter is very good, but if it doesn't translate to practice, then it just stays a paper document. So we need to be mindful of this and continue our work. There are 5 main actions in the Gender Charter, and so you can see them listed on the slide, and you also have the link to the website where you can read the full charter if you want to. I'm only going to highlight the second one, the one on recruitment, as this is the main focus of today. And the charter really works in 2-fold ways. So we have 2 big categories. There are detailed action lines, detailed action points per key action. So for recruitment, we have sub-actions as to what can actually be done. And then there's a category with suggestions and tools for implementation as well. And here this is more of a suggestion, and then the charter and the action lines, which are commitments and formal commitments, as of course every context is different, and how you implement things also depends on the specific context. The context of the university, but also the context of the faculty, or even of a particular group. So what is under that action 2 concerning recruitment? So what did universities commit themselves to? But it was agreed on that each university would develop a gender and diversity sensitive procedures for recruitment and promotion, and also to make sure that these would be respected, these procedures. To develop a roadmap to eliminate possible bias in recruitment and selection procedures. And there were some specifics there too as to what needed specific attention. And we have seen that some of these universities are already doing this, but at the same time there are some things that might need to be highlighted again. For example, the final point as to assessing reference letters, citations, and teaching evaluations that we might come back to. But teaching evaluations can also have implicit gender bias, right? So how do we treat this? How much weight do we give to these? How do we engage with them? And what is the place and the value of these teaching evaluations within these committees or within these particular procedures? And these are things that need to be discussed, and we need to be aware But implicit bias can also show up in these documents, which are perhaps taken sometimes as objective measures, but of course bias sits everywhere on every level. So we need to make sure that we keep this in mind as well. Other concrete actions concern also promotion, right, where some of the same things come into play. And then also the idea that we already heard about of the vanguard, the diversity and gender vanguard, which actually every Flemish university said would be a good idea and committed themselves to having on a faculty level, of making sure that someone would keep on track, that someone would be responsible for this and would have the legitimacy to speak out and to have this as their specific role in making people aware of gender bias and speaking up, and making sure that also good practices are followed up on in every committee or across different committees. And then something that is also very important is the monitoring. Monitoring of both recruitment and also of promotions, and not just who gets the job, but also who's applying for the job in the first instance, right, in the first place. We need to know whether a vacancy was spread widely enough in order to see whether we actually are reaching the people that we want to reach and have made an effort to reach them. We do not just need figures as to how many women were hired on a university level. We take the example of women, we can discuss in different categories as well. We also need to see this on a faculty level, for example, or even in particular domains, because if I'm hiring 100% in the humanities of women and 0% in the sciences and the hard sciences, then perhaps that too creates a not ideal situation that doesn't show up in these figures. So we need to have fine-grained tools and fine-grained measuring as well, so that we know things, so that we can start also fine-tuning our policies and fine-tuning our tools more. So this is an overview of the 5 actions again and how they were described. This was published in our magazine, Maya. And it actually provides for the segue to our next speaker, Beatrice, who will highlight some of the figures to make sure that we understand what the problem really is, and also some concrete tips and tricks as to how we can actually improve things.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, there was already mention of the scissors diagram, the leaky pipeline before. I'm showing this to you once more. You see the representation of men and women in a typical academic career at a European level, and we see that for the early stages, indeed, as doctoral students, graduates, women are slightly in the advantage, but then moving up, you see a big gap appearing between men and women. Now, this is for the European level. As Birgit also mentioned at the beginning of her talk, it's also interesting to see where Belgium stands compared to these European figures. So let me focus on that a little bit more. We just need to continue. There we are. First of all, let's start at the very beginning, right? So the doctoral degree. As you can see, these are quite recent numbers, not entirely recent, but these are the most recent numbers we could find for Belgium as a whole. So in the last decade, roughly speaking, you can see indeed a slight increase as for a number of women who obtained a PhD. But if you compare that to the European level, to further contextualize it a little bit, we actually see that Belgium is far from being the best students in the class. So compared to Europe, we're still far off from the general level of 48%. And now if you look at the other end, look at the grade A positions, the full professorships, again, we see indeed a slight increase over the years, up to 20%, but yet again, this is below the European average of 26%. And then since we are discussing decision-making processes, selection committees, etc. today, it might also be interesting to look at representation of women in boards, both as members and as leaders, and then you can indeed see that there is some improvement. If you look at the numbers between 2017 and 2019, in 2019, 1 out of 4 board members were indeed women, and 14% of the leaders were also women. And yet again, compared to Europe, this is still below the average of 24.5 and 31%, to be more precise. So that's for the numbers. And as Birgit already mentioned, we designed a toolbox on the website where we give a clear overview of actions that can be taken at different stages in the process. And for today's talk, we decided to tease these out in terms of different levels of agency. So there's a number of things that you can do as an individual researcher. There's also a number of things that you can do within your team, and of course, a lot of actions that can be taken at the level of the institution, as was discussed today. For instance, you yourself as a team lead, you can indeed try to lead by example, so to speak, walk the talk. You could also say, for instance, by raising awareness on gender bias within your group with your team members. Give a good example, for instance, by monitoring your own work-life balance. And as has been mentioned, most of the applications are actually decentralized and written by promoters, by faculty staff. And then again, it is important to also look at these vacancy tests yourself. So it's important to actually combine all of these levels of agency to actually create change and see that the change is effective in the long term. Now for today, for the remainder of my presentation, I will focus on the 3 stages, so to speak, of the recruitment process, what you could do before the recruitment process, what could happen during, and what happens after the recruitment process once the final candidate has been selected. Again, a lot of things have already been mentioned, which is actually a good thing, because that means that a lot of the action points that we decided upon in 2019 are already being implemented right now. So many of these action points will sound as a summary, as a reminder of what was discussed today, but that might also be a good thing, right? One of the things that have not been mentioned until now is actually that you can also test your own gender bias actively. As Birgit mentions, we are much more defined by gender bias than we mostly think, and we do make assumptions, associations between certain groups and certain characteristics, and it's actually a very handy online tool, a test that you could do, the Harvard Implicit Bias Test, which not uniquely focuses on gender, but also on race and other potential bias regarding other aspects. So that's very much recommended. And then, as was mentioned before, indeed, when writing a vacancy text, see to it that it is gender neutral, because many of these vacancies are not. And I know that there was actually mention of online tools in the previous panel. You can see them there. So we've added these to the presentation, the gender bias calculator and the gender decoder, so as to actually write and provide gender neutral text, which then can engage people from different backgrounds. And then, as was also mentioned, try to distribute these more widely than within your own network, move beyond your own network, for instance, by contacting networks of which you know that they actually focus on representation of diverse profiles, so as to make sure that you reach all possible candidates. That is as far as the agency for yourself as a team lead and within your team is concerned. Of course, the institution is a very important player. We should provide training for awareness, that has already been mentioned and apparently also applied, as we could learn today. It is important to implement this at all levels, right? So not just for selection committees, deans, also heads of departments, etc. And two, as Birgit also mentioned, it's important also not to just implement these in a structural way, but also to monitor what the effects are, right? To monitor whether these are actually implemented and what is the possible feedback that comes out of these sessions. Universities should also be encouraged to exchange best practices, and that's actually one of the objectives of our gender charter, right? To invite universities to actively engage in a dialogue and exchange these practices. As far as monitoring is concerned, there should indeed also be attention paid to monitoring gender balance throughout the whole recruitment process. So not just, as you said, at initial stages, but also look at potential gender imbalance at later stages so that you can address these in future requirement processes. Then what happens during the selection? Indeed, there was a lot of mention about selecting about the selection committee and representation of diverse profiles within the selection committee, members from different backgrounds. My colleague from Leuven testified as being a gender diversity responsible, a gender vanguard. So it's indeed interesting within the selection committee to appoint one specific member who can then assess possible gender bias and address other committee members if that is the case. As for selection criteria, that has already been mentioned, so I will try to be brief. So indeed, define on basic criteria compared to nice to haves, and define what these criteria are, and make sure that all members know what is meant by specific criteria. Maybe just to give one example to illustrate this. For instance, if you're indeed looking for international experience, very often that is defined as in terms of a long research stay abroad, which is much more difficult for people with caregiving tasks to combine. So you could actually consider broadening the definition and agree upon that you also look at other forms of international experience. And then there has been much reference made to gendered texts already, right? In terms of teaching evaluations also, as he just mentioned, but also vacancy text. But one should also not forget that recommendation letters are also often gendered. For instance, research has shown that recommendation letters for men are actually often much longer than for women, and focus also on different aspects, right? Recommendation letters for men more often focus on competence, specific experience, excellence, whereas for women, you see more often reference being made to commitment, dedication, teaching assignments, etc. Another aspect which has not been mentioned today, so I will briefly go into that, is the actual research time. So when you, as a selection committee, when you're assessing research outputs, it's interesting not to focus indeed just on the numbers, but to focus on research output in terms of actual research time, because this might vary significantly on profiles of candidates. That is to say that, for instance, research has shown that women have more tendency to combine research with other tasks, teaching assignments, but also administrative tasks, and that of course has an effect also on the actual research time. Women still more than men take paternal leave, which then also again influences on the actual research time. So if you're going to assess outputs and look at the numbers, also take that into account. The bio sketch or the narrative CV has already been mentioned also. Maybe I could just briefly emphasize why this is so important. It's actually a text in which candidates can take agency, right, over their own profile, actively shape their own profile, focus on specific merits and competences, but also in case of career breaks, they can actually contextualize these and explain how and when these actually affected, right? How these affected their actual research time and potential research output. So it's a text which is an illustration of that and draws attention to that in a very specific way. Then, once the candidates have been selected, there's of course the interview. There again, a lot of aspects have already been raised, so I will go briefly over this. There's an important role to be played, of course, by the selection committee chair, who has to see to, indeed, the fact that each candidate is allowed the same amount of time, that the same questions are asked, so committee objective criteria. One of the things you could do within a selection committee is, for instance, to assign specific criteria to specific committee members who then actually monitor that specific question for each and every interview, so that at the end of the day, you can actually more objectively compare these specific criteria instead of having to focus on the entire interview. Should there still be questions concerning career planning or potential grades instead of based on your own assumptions, instead of interpreting these, address this during the interview so that candidates can react and reply. Once the final candidate has been selected, there are still a number of things that can be done which have not been discussed today and which should be done. For instance, provide feedback, provide sound, substantial feedback to all candidates, again, based on these fixed criteria, so that each and every one of them has the tools to improve, to change for further applications in the future. So that is a very important aspect. And of course, it does not stop when the candidate is selected, especially in the early years, in the early stages. It's very important to mentor young professors, to provide career counseling, but even further up the ladder, it's important to continue counseling. During career breaks, it's also important to provide structural support. For instance, say that a person wants to work 80%, discuss this within the team, see to it that indeed part of the tasks are handed over to other team members, so that not to avoid a situation where the person actually does the same amount of teaching but in less time and for a lower salary, which still happens sometimes. And see to it also that especially research is being preserved, because that of course has also an effect on the chances of these candidates for tenure and later on for promotion. And of course, and I would like to end there, is during the whole process, it's important as a team lead, as a member of ZAP, as a professor, to monitor your own work-life balance. Again, give a good example, lead by example, but also see to it that, for instance, you do not plan meetings beyond working hours, outside working hours, that you allow and even actively encourage your team members to take parental leave, so to really not just give a good example, but also actively encourage your team members to do the same.
And we end with a number of tools that the Young Academy has invested in or has worked on together with other partners. And so first of all, our website, Wetenschap is mvx.be, where you can find a lot of the same information, as well as more detailed information as to tools, tricks and tips. And the toolbox especially is very useful. We have an image of that as well on the slide. And you can also download the posters. We invested in postcards as well if you want to spread them in your university or in your department to raise awareness. You can, they're all freely available online. We have an info sheet for the COVID-19 situation that you can use in committees just to remind them that this may not be over just yet, but even if it were over, that these can have effects that can be long-lasting, that we shouldn't be too quick to forget about them either. And then you have the Youth Charter, which is also freely available online, and for those of you who want to read it again with all the actions that were taken and also the suggestions for how to implement them. Of course, it doesn't stop there. We're looking ahead towards the future. What's next? Well, for the Young Academy, this will be about continuing our work on gender in academia.
by monitoring these best practices for creating a platform for exchange across the different universities, a bit like we had today, but also with other partners involved, so all the universities would be invited. We have a working group on diversity in higher education, as already mentioned, which is taking some of these issues, but also looking at what other things can we do, as not everything can be easily transplanted from gender to other categories of diversity. They also have their own challenges and specificities, and also different partners sometimes that need to be taken on board, consulted, and creating a more diverse and inclusive environment. And then we also have a very, very recent working group on sexual harassment or unwanted transgressive behaviour to address those issues as well, especially given recent developments of things that came out in the media and clearly showed that there's a need to talk about these and to see what can be done, not just within universities, but also across universities. And that is also where the Young Academy would like to be a part of, or would like to chip in and see what can be done together with others. So this is really it for us, for the presentation and for all three of us. I'm not sure how much time there is for questions and discussion. In case there is not that much time, please know that we would be very open to receiving suggestions or having a dialogue, even on a different time or sort of different platform. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It was a very comprehensive overview with a few very new insights and additional ideas. Also, I like the idea of putting Belgium in the European perspective. Of course, this comes from my job, but I think it's also interesting to see that yes, there is progress, but there is still a big margin for more progress. I think we can, maybe there will be a few minutes indeed for a few questions, but we maybe go to the mentee, the last mentee question. Actually, the three of you put a point that's really important, I think, is the idea of agency. So it's not only what it is and what we hope that will be. It's not only institutional, but it's also the idea that everyone can contribute to improving the situation. And I think this was very clear in the three of your presentation. And actually, this was also the question that we wanted to ask to the mentee. So those who wish, take your mobile phone and answer this question. When you go back to work next week, what will you do to increase gender fair recruitment? And it can be several answers ranging from nothing, which we hope not too many of you will answer, to yes, reflect, read paper of what's existing, contacting a gender team, talk to different types of people, your peers, your supervisor, your students, get ready yourself to recruit more gender fairly. Or if you're an applicant, if you're an early career scientist and you're intending to apply, maybe use some of the tips and tricks and the tools from the toolboxes which have been provided to get prepared. And I'm happy to see you're gonna do several things and not nothing. So I think this is really a call for action, and this might be a good way of ending, except that we still have 5 minutes for burning questions from the audience or just additional suggestions. Yes, there is one question there. And then we'll go on.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if you know what are the other countries, the countries that do better on gender balance, or do they do differently?
Yeah, I don't know. I can first say, well, which are the countries that are at the top. So the first one was Albania, the second one was Germany, and the third one was Iceland. So we would have to look at those particular countries to see what they're doing. And this can be done, I think, through the young academies as well, and across Europe as there are other young academies, and so we can easily use the network to see what it's been doing. There might be different reasons for that. I can't answer it immediately. But thank you for the question.
My question was about the statistics and if you differentiate for nationality with like the backgrounds of candidates or researchers, because at least in my department, most of the researchers who are female are not Belgian, or those who are non-white are also not Belgian, so maybe that might explain why there's such a big drop after PhD and postdoc.
I also have a question about this FLIR contract that the university signed. Do you know anything about the impact? How much has it been implemented?
Well, that is actually one of the action points that we still need to carry out as a young academy, and as Birgit mentioned, there will be a follow-up in the fall. Of course, we have been in contact with all universities, precisely because there has been the COVID crisis, right? And Birgit mentioned, we made up again a set of agreements specifically focused on the COVID crisis and possible effects in terms of gender imbalance. And there we could indeed already assess, so to speak, the implementation of specific strategies. And it's interesting to see that all 5 universities actually took actions on very different levels. Of course, also often in relation to their own policies, so that's actually quite natural. But it was again a very important and interesting, let's say, conversation that we had, which also allowed us as a young academy to kind of carry out an intermediary assessment of the implementation. So we know that a lot of actions are being taken now and are still going to be rolled out in the future, but we're actually planning to do a full monitoring in the fall. So we don't have like specific numbers or anything that we can give you.
Thank you. Kari, for you, I also had a question. So I think the video you have is super instructive and really great. But I was wondering, so it's only for the selection committees for NWO. Is it something similar in the Netherlands that exists for individual professors that hire people themselves?
Currently, no, but I think the video is transferable to many contexts. What we are doing though is that with different events and conferences that we as NWO organize, we have a workshop on this very topic as well, where we also show the video and then have tips and tools and also practical assignments on how to apply this on your own context, whether it be in teaching or research or in recruitment.
Okay, great, thanks.
We'll have to close the session soon, so I'd like to thank you all again. And the president of BeWiSe, for last closing words.
Yes, I want to thank everybody again, all the speakers, excellent speakers. I really enjoyed also the dynamics and the debate. Yeah, I think a lot of questions, it means that it was a good debate. So I also want to thank again the FNRS for funding this unique location and opportunity to gather again after 2 years of digital meetings. And saying this, I'd also like to invite everybody to our next year's Women in Science event. So then we again try to do it in February, as the date is 11th of February. Also some other things, if you didn't subscribe yet to our email list, please do so. And also forward it to your networks. So you are there not only for women, of course, as you can see today, but also for men who like to tackle this gender inequality. Finally, also, there's a few things coming up. You can check our agenda online on the website. The next event we have is from Califet, and it's in Brussels, so it's on the 30th of April. And it's a very interesting event because then we will have some female researchers speaking to students, so school students. So I think it's very important there that we raise this point of awareness. And yeah, you can't be what you can't see. So I think it's very important that also female researchers show themselves on stage. So I would like to thank everybody again and invite you for our next meeting.
One last very practical announcement. There is food and fruit left. We don't like to throw this out, so please help yourself before you leave. Thank you.
Stoppen, met dat te draaien is dat er echt wel uitgevallen is. Nee,